Disclaimer before we get into this video, I just recorded it and I was saying the wrong name for Synwave Revolution. I was actually saying Cycle Revolution, so every time I say Cycle Revolution I meant Synwave Revolution. Into the video. Hi guys, and welcome back to Keep Smiling Adventures, and in today's video we will be taking a look at dynamos and how I set up my bike with the dynamo and how I set it up and how I use it while bike packing, and generally just everything dynamo in this video. First things first, let's just go over how I set up and use the dynamo. So I have a dynamo hub, just like this one in my hand here. They are pretty much a standard hub, apart from they have this one magic ability to produce power. I'm not going to go into too much detail of how that does it because I'm not that clued up on it, but basically it's magnets. Magnets inside here cause a bit of friction and then that can produce power. On my bike, that dynamo hub is attached to this cable which attaches to this little plug bit here, and that goes up to a Cycle Revolution USB converter, should we call it. Basically what that does is that converts the power that you've produced from riding on a dynamo hub into the correct voltage for like a USB device, a GPS or a phone or a power bank, anything like that. Now, quick note is you're not going to be getting full super fast charge like you get on a lot of smartphones nowadays. It is basically like plugging a USB cable or your phone, for example, into a laptop USB port. So it's not super fast, but it is very useful for just keeping everything charged. So from that Cycle Revolution little converter, you essentially just plug any USB to then micro USB, USB-C, anything basically that goes to a USB to whatever, and as you ride it charges. Now this particular device, if you stop, it stops charging. If you continue, it charges. Now to get it to charge, for example, the GPS unit I'm using is the Garmin 830, I think. I'm not sure, I'll put it on screen. But it's, as soon as you get to around 7-8 miles an hour, you will be charging. Now it's, again, like I said, it's not like a super fast charge, but it is enough to just keep your GPS at that speed, will be keeping it at the level it is, and then a little bit faster you'll be producing enough power to charge it while actually riding. You may notice I have two dynamo cables attached to my fork here. Now that is because I use a dynamo light for when I'm riding at night, and I also use it primarily in the day for charging my GPS unit. Now you can go down the route, I'm pretty sure any half decent electrician will be able to make you one, but they are pretty niche, so they're kind of custom made to be able to just have a switch to switch between the two, and I just have one plugged in, so you can switch between a GPS unit or your light. So as you can see on my fork, it's basically set up so when I want to switch between light and GPS or USB charging, I just unplug it and plug the other one in. You can see I've basically got this little cable tie hack, should we call it. It works perfectly. It takes literally seconds to just flip one out, plug it in, and it keeps the other cable away on the outer side of my fork, and it never falls. I've gone over lots of rough stuff, it never falls. I will say, something you can do with dynamos, what I don't think a lot of people know, but you can just run the cables, and I'll show you what I mean on screen now, is you can actually run both of these cables, so the light and for the USB, into the same plug, and it does work. Now, with the light I'm using, it's brightest if I'm going faster. So obviously if it's being split between two things, that means it's kind of harder to get the full beam on the light, which isn't too much of an issue on road. So when I'm riding this on road, I actually just, or I have done in the past, plug it into the same plug and it works fine. It charges the GPS. Because you can keep a constant speed, you're normally going faster, but while off-road, it's just generally not that great practice because you're normally going too slow. You normally just can't keep up a as high speed as when you're on the road, so it doesn't work as good off-road. So probably best to just keep them 1-to-1. And also, I'm not really sure how good it is for the light or the GPS device. I don't really see how it could be bad because basically both of these devices only push out power at a point that is enough to run the device at whatever it's meant to run at. But that is a little secret tip you can do, and I have done it for many years on the road side of things, because especially with this light, which we'll go over at the end of this video, it's bloody bright, so it doesn't need to be that bright on the road. Let's take a look at the actual hub itself. Now, this hub here weighs around 350 grams. Now, a typical front hub for a disc wheel will be probably anywhere from 150 to 250 grams, say. So it is obviously a bit heavier. That's to be expected. That is a slight weight penalty that you will have with these hubs. But again, it's not an absolutely huge amount. It's around 200 grams, maybe 250 at a push. And another thing that I want to clear up with these hubs, and it's a question that I get asked quite a lot with these hubs, is can you feel the resistance? The problem is with that question, it's a yes and no answer, because yes, you can feel the resistance if you have it in your hand and you try and push the wheel round. Or even just like on the bike, if you just try and spin the wheel round with your hand, you can feel a slight bump in it. It's not as smooth as a standard wheel. Now, when you're riding, absolutely no, you cannot feel that resistance. There is a slight resistance there because there has to be to produce the power, but it's not enough for you to ever feel like it's dragging. Honestly, yes, there is technically some resistance there, and you are technically losing some power to this Dynamo hub, but to say you can actually feel it is a no from me. You generally cannot feel it. The only time you can feel it is if you try to move the wheel with your hand, and it's just a general bump, bump, bump as the magnets are inside this hub. Another thing to note with these hubs are, unfortunately, they are completely a sealed unit. It is a positive thing and a negative thing, in my opinion, because you can't service it yourself. Now, this one is a Shutter Precision Dynamo hub, SP Dynamo hubs. Now, if you brought this directly from them, they will service it for you. You have to send it back to them to do that. In my experience, this hub here has got like 15 to 20,000 miles on it, and although it is a bit grindy now and it's not quite as buttery smooth as it once was, it's still functioning, it still charges things, and it still rolls fine. That is the benefit of it being a sealed unit, is it takes a lot more of a beating, but when it does eventually go, you'll probably have to send it back to be fixed or just completely replace it, but they do have quite a long lifespan. So to be able to actually charge your GPS device with a Dynamo, you need the converter. Now, there are a few options on the market. However, the most common ones I am going to actually cover in this video because I own both of them. One of them is the Cycle Revolution one that is on the bike here, and the other one is the Bush & Muller USB work. Now, I've chosen to do these two because they're slightly different in the way they function, and they both, in my opinion, have positives and negatives. Now, the Cycle Revolution one that I'm currently using on both of my bikes, and you'll understand why in a minute, that one essentially, if you are moving at say 6-7 miles per hour, you will be charging whatever it is plugged into. As soon as you stop, no power, nothing. You obviously cannot produce any power, so you're not charging anything. Now, with the Bush & Muller USB work, this has a built-in battery. So if you've been riding for like 10-20 minutes, this battery essentially charges up first, and then it uses the battery to produce the power to your devices, your Garmin, your Wahoo, whatever you are charging. So the positive and beneficial thing of having a built-in battery to the Bush & Muller USB work is that when you stop at some traffic lights, or maybe you're hiking up a big hill, your device is still charging, which is a really nice and good thing. However, the negative thing here is batteries die. And unfortunately, Bush & Muller, as far as I can find, you cannot replace this battery. Now, this is the reason I'm actually not using this device at the moment on any of my bikes, is because the battery has died on me, and so it's no longer working. Now, I will say, I had this for like 6 or 7 years before it did that, and it was in storage for like two years. As long as you're actually continuously using it, you shouldn't really have any issues, and I'm sure you can find somebody out there that can probably change the battery in these. But it is definitely worth a consideration, because the Cycle Revolution one will essentially work forever. As it has no battery to die, it will continue working. Now, Bush & Muller do a version of the Cycle Revolution one where it doesn't have a battery and it works basically the same as that. However, on that note, the Cycle Revolution one, as a very simple device, doesn't have replaceable parts. Now, I've heard good things about the company. You can send it off to them and they'll fix anything that you need fixing on it. However, with the Bush & Muller, it's very nice. Like any cables, if you break a cable, you snag the USB bit, you can just change it. You can just buy all the cables again and they're replaceable. Now, if they just did the battery, I would actually really prefer this device, especially while on very mountain bikey, bikepacking trips, stuff where you need to hike a lot. The Bush & Muller definitely works slightly better than the Cycle Revolution one. However, the Cycle Revolution one will probably outlast your Bush & Muller one. Now, the Cycle Revolution one, I think, I put on screen, retails around 120, 130 pounds, so they're not cheap. While the Bush & Muller one retails, I think, around the £100 mark, so they're both not cheap. Now, I will say there was this one that I used many years ago, and I wish I could recommend it because it was actually my favourite, because it was about £50. It had a switch. It used to work pretty much the way the Cycle Revolution one. It didn't have a battery, but it also had a off switch, a USB output switch, and then you could wire it up to a Dynamo light if you wanted. Now, I'll put a picture of it on screen. I can't figure out who makes it. I can't remember where I got it from. It was so long ago. But yeah, that was probably the best one. It was a bit bulkier than these two, but however, it just attached to the fork quite nicely. What I'll do is I'll put a picture of it on screen. If anyone knows the make or brand or whatever one it was, let me know, because I would like to know as well. So, like I said, with both of these USB converters, they charge basically the same as if you plugged it into an old USB port in a laptop. So it's not crazy fast, but you can 100% charge a Garmin GPS or Wahoo GPS, basically any of the GPSs, because they're all relatively low in power consumption, pretty quickly. I've really done a test, but I will say within maybe 4 hours, 5 hours of riding, you could probably go from 10% to 100% on a Garmin GPS, as long as you're relatively consistently traveling at maybe like 12 to 15 mile an hour. Now, with the Cycle Revolution one, when you drop to about 5 or 6 mile an hour, it starts charging, uncharging, charging, uncharging, which in some ways can actually use more power than you're actually producing. If you're going to be on a very hiker-bikey type route where there's going to be lots of stop and start, then the Bush & Muller one might be a slightly better option for you, because it will still charge, it will still continue charging even though you're not moving or moving below a certain speed. So the way I use the Dynamo hub is primarily for charging my Garmin, my GPS unit, and lights, but we'll go over the lights at the end of this video. Now, with charging the GPS unit, you can charge other things. You could charge your phone. Phone batteries are pretty big nowadays. Even when phones are on like airplane mode, they still use quite a lot of power. So it's not really that great for that kind of thing. If you're using a phone, then yes, you can keep it, you'll be able to keep it topped up, but by the time you stop and then you use your phone like 10 minutes, you will have lost like 10-20%, and it's just a faff. So what I personally do is I keep my phone actually turned off for pretty much all day. I keep it on me so I've got easy access to it. If I fall or whatever, I can grab it. I keep it turned off, and then that way I can actually not need to charge my phone for like 2 or 3 days. I only really turn it off maybe when I get into camp, send a few texts to people, let them know where I am or whatever. I know a few people, and I have done it in the past, just charge directly into my phone. It does work. However, off-road, you're just kind of traveling a bit too slow to really make any difference. So you'll probably always be battling, and phones just use too much power. Does work. Wouldn't recommend it. Obviously, directly charge into the Garmin all day, that stays 100%. I do carry a power bank. Now this is a NIU power bank, NIU power bank. It's a 10,000 22.5 watt. It's a fast charger, and I pretty much use this primarily for GoPro batteries and my phone when it needs it every 3 days maybe. You can also, and I'll say it again, it's only really worth it if you know you're going to be able to continuously ride at a certain pace, over 10 mile an hour, let's say. You can plug this into your Dynamo converter, and you will be able to keep this topped up. If I needed to, and I have done it in the past, I can charge this. They're pretty slow to charge through the Dynamo. You know, you're looking at maybe like, especially these ones, they're like 10,000 milliamp. You might get 10% in 2 hours, but you know, it's 10%. I'll always carry a power bank like this to charge the phone. I can charge from the Dynamo if I need to. It's there, it can work. However, most of the time I don't really need to. Now, a quick thing of how to wire Dynamo hubs. They're very simple. They are slightly different on different models. I'll show you the one I have here because it's the only type I've got. It's basically just 2 copper wires, and you basically push them through 2 little holes and bend them back over themselves. So that's how I use my Dynamo hub primarily to do my GPS unit. However, I do also run Dynamo lights. Sometimes I do anyway. The lights I am currently running on this bike in Dynamo setup are the Exposure, Revo and Red Eye. Now these lights work in conjunction with each other. Basically the front light runs the rear light, so as you're producing power with your Dynamo hub, that goes into your light, your front light lights up, but it's also pushing some of that power back to the rear light. Now the Exposure Revo front light, let's just go on this first. It's an incredibly bright light. It's quite old now. They haven't really updated it, and I kind of wish they did, but we'll go over some of the reasons why I wish they did in a minute. It is an incredibly bright light. It's also a light that when you stop at some traffic lights, it stays illuminated. So you can use this on the road because it stays illuminated when you stop. So you still have lights. And again, that's with the backlight as well. Exposure say, and I think they are a little optimistic with this, they say it can last up to an hour after you stop the front light, and you could set up camp with that light. I'm gonna say that's just like, no. I've got to camp before, and although you have maybe like a few minutes of where it's quite bright, it doesn't take long before it to dip and then dip again, and then not to be bright enough to be able to sort of see what you're setting up or how you're setting up camp. Now it will last obviously a little bit longer if you're not using the red eye, the exposure red eye, which is the rear light I'm using. However, I think if you're going to use Dynamo lights, you're probably going to want the rear light as well. So I would actually say you only get maybe like 5 minutes max where it's actually at a brightness level where you can use it as like a torch. After that, it's more of a be seen light. However, when you're riding it, it's plenty bright enough, if anything too bright sometimes for the road. So I want to talk about some of the downsides to this light. And one of them is the cost. Like, it's not a light that many people are going to want to warrant paying that much. The front light costs £240 retail. Sometimes you get it on sale, you get it a bit cheaper, but still it's around that price. And then the rear light, which I think is actually good value, is about £35. Now the rear light for that price, absolute bargain. I think it's incredibly bright. It lights up the road behind you red, so people can see you from a long way out, which is great. However, the front light being £250, and I know they're kind of a niche product, so there's a slight hike in price. It's kind of overpriced in my opinion. Possibly wouldn't be overpriced if it was modernized a bit. These are the things I wish this light had. I wish I could just turn it off. You get home and it will stay lit up for about an hour, albeit not very bright after about 10 minutes, say. I wish I could just kind of turn that off, because the rear light will stay on for a good few hours after that as well. And when you're wild camping, I don't particularly want my lights to stay on. I wish I could just turn them off. I also wish, like when I'm on the road, like I was saying, this front light is incredibly bright. I don't want to blind people when I'm on the road. And when you're going down a hill and you're picking up speed, it goes to full beam. There's no way to back that off. There's no dim switch. It's just full beam. To be really careful how you position this light while riding on the road. Now obviously when you're off-road, you might position that a bit differently so you can see more of the trail, because you're not going to be blinding as many people. But when you're on the road, you know, you need to make sure it's down. It's just a bit of a faff. And that actually brings me on quite nicely. I'm not a huge fan of the exposure mounts. Now they can be used both ways, so you can go on top of your bar or under your bar, but they just, I don't know, they just feel a bit fiddly to me. And there are plenty of other mounts, but again, they are not exactly cheap. There are aftermarket mounts where you can get mounted underneath your like Garmin out front mounts and stuff like that. However, it's just one of them things. I'm just not really a huge fan of their mounts. I've mentioned how this light performs when you're on the road and how you need to be a bit careful with it, because the brightness is determined by the speed you are traveling. And off-road, that is no different. So when you are going up a hill, say, it will dip slightly. I will say, as long as you can sort of travel around 8, 9, 10 miles per hour, it will be bright enough to go uphill at that speed. However, the one thing I have been caught out with, if you are only going to use this as the only light on your bike with off-road riding, is when you get to a hiker bike section and then you're maybe hiking up for maybe like 5 minutes, say, that light that is now being produced is basically non-existent, and it's very hard to see where you're going. So if you're going to use this on some quite technical terrain where hiker bike or very slow climbing may come into play, I would recommend, and I'd recommend it anyway, is have a helmet light or even just a second light on your bars. So at least if you do have to stop, you can flick on just a normal USB powered one. As an off-road light, it is very good as your sort of main sort of beam. But again, like I say, probably if you're going to be doing anything technical, you're probably going to want a helmet light as well. So guys, there we have it. That is how I set up my Dynamo sort of setup. It's not the neatest, it's not the most beautiful, but you know, it works for me. So I'm hoping that has answered all your questions on how I set up the dynamos and how I use electronics while on bikepacking trips. If you enjoyed this video, if you found it helpful, give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing if you are not already. And until next time, keep smiling, enjoy the adventure. Peace.